Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back. Pull your blanket a little closer, find your most comfortable spot, and settle in, because tonight we are going to go somewhere that most people would never dare to go alone. Tonight, I have gathered a collection of Ouija board stories for you, true, personal accounts shared by real people, each one more unsettling than the last. These are not the kind of stories you read in a book or watch in a movie and then easily forget. These are the kind of stories that stay with you, the kind that crawl into the back of your mind just as you are drifting off to sleep, making you suddenly very aware of every creak in the house, every shadow in the corner of the room, every small sound you cannot immediately explain. So before we begin, I want you to take a slow breath, turn the lights down just a little, maybe make yourself a warm cup of tea, and let the darkness do what darkness does best, let it take control. Now, most of us have grown up hearing warnings about Ouija boards. Perhaps your grandmother told you never to touch one. Perhaps you were raised in a faith that considered them dangerous or even evil. And perhaps, like many of the people in tonight's stories, you brushed those warnings aside, thinking they were nothing more than old superstitions, harmless stories designed to frighten children into behaving. But what happens when those old warnings turn out to be something much more than just stories? What happens when the board actually answers? And not with vague, meaningless letters that could be explained away, but with specific, deeply personal, disturbingly accurate information that leaves you cold and trembling and questioning everything you thought you understood about this world. That is exactly where we are headed tonight, friends. So let us begin. And if you are here with us for the very first time tonight, welcome. We are so glad you found your way here. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and become part of our growing community of listeners. You truly will not want to miss what comes next. Our first story comes from someone who makes it very clear right from the beginning. They have never been someone who sought out the paranormal. And the reason for that is both fascinating and deeply telling. Strange things, unexplained things, unsettling things, they have always found their way to this person without any invitation whatsoever. Lifetime of quiet, creeping weirdness, happening steadily and without warning across the years. And yet, one particular summer evening, this person found themselves doing something that many people would consider unwise, crafting a homemade Ouija board from paper, markers, and an upside-down shot glass. They did it with two close friends, Sarah and Mike. The group sat together first at Sarah's house, where the lights were kept low and the windows were left open, letting the cool night air drift in across the table, carrying with it the soft sounds of the world outside. There was something almost peaceful about it in those early moments. Three friends, a handmade board, flickering shadows, and the kind of curious excitement that comes just before you cross a line you cannot uncross. Later that same night, they took the board somewhere far more dramatic. They carried it into the local cemetery and set it up beneath the pale silver light of the moon. And that is when things began to shift. Sarah and Mike started asking the board questions, not random questions, specific ones. Questions about details that this person knew to be completely and undeniably true, but that neither Sarah nor Mike had ever heard from them, not in any conversation they had shared over the years. And yet the board answered, correctly, in ways that felt far too accurate and far too personal to be chalked up to coincidence or the subtle pressure of fingertips on glass. The narrator felt it immediately, that deep, stomach-dropping recognition that something was actually happening here, something that could not be easily explained away. Then their friend Kayla decided to ask a question of her own. A very specific question about a mutual friend named Mia, a girl who was not even present that night. Kayla wanted to know whether Mia would become pregnant before she turned 19 years old. It was the kind of question that seemed almost absurd to ask, the kind where you half expect nothing to happen, where you wait for the glass to sit perfectly still, and the silence to confirm that the whole thing is just a game. But that is not what happened. The planchette, the upside-down shot glass, began to move. Slowly and deliberately it slid across the handmade board, letter by letter, spelling out a single, unmistakable word. Yes, no hesitation, no pause, just yes. Several months passed after that night. Life went on, and then late one evening the narrator's phone rang. It was Mia calling from across town, and Mia's voice was shaking, raw and unsteady, because she had something to say that she could barely find the words for. She was pregnant. In that moment, all of the air seemed to leave the room. The narrator described feeling struck, completely, physically struck, like something heavy had landed square in the center of their chest. Nothing like that had ever happened before. No prediction, no guess, no random hope had ever come true in such a precise, specific, and deeply personal way. And now it had. The board had known something about Mia's life that none of them could have predicted, and it had come true. exactly as the board had said. Even now, this person carries a complicated mixture of feelings about that night. Part of them feels a kind of amazed, almost electric excitement about the other questions that were asked. But a larger, quieter part of them remains deeply wary, unsettled by the knowledge that whatever moved that glass across the paper that night under the cemetery moonlight was answering with something that felt dangerously close to real knowledge. The homemade board was eventually left leaning against a tombstone, and none of them went back for it. And perhaps that was exactly the right decision to make. Our next story takes us somewhere a little different, not a cemetery or a forest or an abandoned place, but something far more ordinary and therefore somehow far more unsettling. An apartment building, the kind you might live in yourself. A place with thin walls and shared stairwells and neighbors you know just well enough to recognize by sound. The narrator of this story lived in a building divided into 8 separate flats, all stacked and arranged around a single narrow staircase. They did not mix much with the other residents, except for 2 of them, Gary, who lived right next door, and the man who lived directly below their flat. Gary was one of the warmest, most genuinely kind men the narrator had ever had the good fortune to live beside. He had a natural protective quality about him, the kind of man who notices when something is not right and actually does something about it. The neighbor downstairs, however, was something else entirely. Almost immediately after moving in, the narrator noticed that this man, who had introduced himself as Ouija, played music at all hours of the night. Not just loud music, but relentless, inconsiderate, wall-shaking music. Sometimes it went on for a full 24 hours straight without a single moment of quiet. Now the narrator was someone who could sleep through almost anything, a useful quality in a building like that, so the noise did not destroy their nights entirely. But it was rude, and it was thoughtless, and it hung over the whole experience of living there like a low, gray cloud. Still, they chose to stay quiet about it. Confronting someone who lived directly beneath you felt like a risk that simply was not worth taking. Then came a conversation with Gary that changed the entire picture. One day, Gary pulled the narrator aside in the hallway, his expression carrying the unmistakable weight of genuine concern, and asked if they were managing all right with the noise coming from the flat below. He mentioned that he could hear it through his own walls, which meant the sound was traveling through the entire building like a vibration you could feel in your bones. The narrator told him not to worry too much about it, and Gary's shoulders visibly relaxed, though his eyes still carried something unreadable. He admitted he had been worried the narrator might try to confront the man downstairs alone. At just 21 years old, with Gary around 50, it was clear he had simply been looking out for them the way a decent person does. But then Gary told them why he was so particularly worried, and the story took a darker turn. Gary had actually met this man years earlier, back when they worked at the same place. Back then, the man had introduced himself as John, not Ouija, John, and after moving into the flat downstairs, he had introduced himself as Ouija. Gary had quietly gone back to an old colleague to check, and yes, this man had been known to switch between 2 separate identities, sometimes going by one name, sometimes the other, flipping between them without explanation. According to Gary, everyone who knew him from work had quietly come to believe he was living with some kind of personality disorder, though no one ever fully understood which one or how serious it was. The narrator was no expert in mental health, and they were careful not to try to diagnose anything from a distance. But living above this man, lying awake sometimes in the small hours of the morning listening to him shout at voices only he could hear, they began to form a theory. What if he played the music so relentlessly, so deafeningly because he was trying to drown something out? Something inside his own head that would not stop no matter how loud the bass turned up. It was just a theory. It might have been completely wrong. But it was the image that kept forming in the narrator's mind in those quiet, unsettled moments before sleep. Then one evening they came home to find a note aggressively stuck to their front door. The paper was practically torn from the force with which it had been pressed against the door. The message was written entirely in jagged, furious capital letters. "Stop your constant banging. I can't sleep." The narrator worked from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, and when they got home they sat on the sofa, they watched television, they scrolled on their phone, they made tea, they used the bathroom. Ordinary, quiet, entirely unremarkable things. They were most certainly not constantly banging anything against the floor. And yet after the note appeared, Weiss began hammering on his ceiling, their floor at completely random intervals, regardless of whether anyone upstairs had even moved. He would pound on it when the narrator had not shifted from the sofa in more than an hour. He would slam it at 4 in the morning when they had been sound asleep in bed for hours. It made no logical sense, which itself became its own kind of unease. The narrator's boyfriend tried knocking on Ouija's door on multiple occasions, calmly and patiently, hoping for some kind of reasonable conversation. Ouija never answered, not once. And then, as the narrator puts it, things began to creep into genuinely strange territory. Narrator does not consider themselves a true believer in ghosts. They hold a skeptical attitude about the paranormal in general, a product of having long ago accepted that old buildings groan and settle and produce all kinds of sounds that the imagination can easily run away with. Their boyfriend occasionally said unsettling things in his sleep, but he was a regular sleep talker, and so those murmurs were never taken seriously. And yet, for all their skepticism, they did own a Ouija board. And every now and then, curiosity would get the better of them, and they would bring it out just to see, just to check if anything at all would happen. One night, the narrator and their boyfriend decided to use the board in the living room. Lights low, curtains drawn, they had tried it once before in that same flat with absolutely nothing to show for it. But this particular night, the planchette began to move, and the atmosphere in the room shifted immediately into something that felt different, heavier, somehow more charged. Most of the movements led nowhere interesting, random letters that assembled into nothing meaningful, which the narrator chalked up to unconscious hand pressure and nervous energy. But there was a feeling in their chest they could not quite dismiss. A low, humming wrongness. The candles they had lit kept flickering hard in a way that felt unpleasant rather than atmospheric. Then the board spelled out 2 words, "Find me." Slowly, deliberately, but clearly. The narrator asked, keeping their voice as steady as possible so their boyfriend would not see how shaken they were already. "Where are you?" The planchette moved again, and it spelled "where body." In that moment, the narrator read it as nonsense, a garbled, meaningless phrase. Where body? It made no sense. So they called it, abruptly said goodbye, moved the planchette to the corner, switched the light back on, and announced they were bored. They were not, of course. The truth was that they were frightened, genuinely, properly frightened, and they thought they could hear things shifting somewhere in the flat, sounds that should not have been there. They did not want their boyfriend to see it, because he was the believer between them and they were the skeptic, and admitting fear felt like something they could not do in that moment. Only later, sitting quietly on the sofa with the board put away and the lights bright, did the true meaning land. It had not said where body. It had said where hid body, 3 separate words spelled one after another. Where hid body. The narrator's stomach dropped straight through the floor when that realization hit. They told their boyfriend what they believed the board had actually been saying. He laughed. He rolled his eyes. He told them it was a very nice try and assumed the whole thing had been staged for effect, that they had deliberately pushed the planchette and then pretended to misread the message to make everything feel more convincingly scary. He still believes that to this day. But the narrator insists, clearly, firmly, that they were not moving the planchette on purpose and were not faking any part of their confusion. Out of a curiosity, they could not. Seemed to shake, they began searching. Local crimes, unsolved disappearances, cold cases that might somehow connect to the message the board had spelled. Nothing surfaced that linked cleanly to their area or to Ouija's life or approximate age. There were no social media accounts for him under either name. There was very little to be found online about him at all, beyond eventually learning his full real name. Nothing more sinister than that could be confirmed. To this day, the narrator does not know what the board actually meant, or why it spelled what it spelled, or whether there is any connection at all to the strange, volatile man living below them. They are the first to admit that there are plenty of logical explanations: unconscious movement, coincidence, a mind already primed for unease reaching for patterns in noise. But the whole experience frightened them more deeply than they are entirely comfortable admitting, even now. And they cannot help but find a strange, dark humor in imagining how infuriated that hypothetical ghost must have been, watching someone confidently misread, where hid body, as where'd body, and declare the board was doing nothing. The thought would almost be funny if it did not also leave them with the persistent, crawling sensation of being watched whenever the memory of that night surfaces. They moved out of the flat a few months later, and they have not touched the Ouija board since. If this kind of story speaks to something you have personally experienced, if you have ever felt that something was watching, or that the ordinary spaces of your life were not quite as ordinary as they appeared, we would genuinely love to hear from you. Write to us in the comments below and share your thoughts. You might be surprised to find how many others understand exactly what you mean. Our next story begins in the place where so many stories like this begin, a backyard that backs up to somewhere you are not supposed to go. The narrator lives on a mountain with a large yard. Beyond the chain link fence at the property's edge, the land drops away into something the whole neighborhood calls the gully. Technically, they looked it up once and discovered it should be called a ravine. But gully feels more honest somehow, rougher and stranger, and more appropriate to what the place actually is. And what it is deep, much deeper than it appears from above, more cramped and shadowed and alive, with the kind of unsettled energy that makes you instinctively want to keep your distance. Even on bright, sunny days, the light barely reaches the bottom. The narrow forest of scrub oak and stubborn sage brush swallows it whole. Most of the children in the neighborhood give it a wide berth. Most of the adults actively try to keep curious teenagers from climbing through the fence to investigate. The reason for the caution is not just the practical danger of rattlesnakes and unstable ground, though those things are real. It is also the story. The local legend that has been passed down for decades, repeated in quiet voices, warning that a group of teenagers actually died down in the gully about 30 years ago, and that whoever was responsible for their deaths was never caught, never charged, never convicted. The case went cold and stayed cold, buried somewhere in a filing cabinet alongside other things that the town eventually stopped talking about out loud. Growing up alongside this legend, the narrator assumed it was simply a scare story, the kind adults invent to keep young people out of genuinely hazardous places, a useful fiction dressed as history. But there was always something that nagged at the edges of that dismissal, a feeling, never quite gone, that whatever was down there in the gully's dark and tangled bottom was more than just geography. So about 2 months before this story was written, the narrator made a decision. They arranged to stay over at a friend's house, a friend named Alex, who lived so close to the gully that the tree line was visible from the driveway, and they had already decided quietly and privately what they were going to do. They were going to go down there. Finally. After years of living alongside that fence and that drop and that story, they were going to find out what was actually at the bottom. When they told Alex the plan, Alex did not hesitate. They were more excited than afraid, and they wanted to come along rather than simply cover for the narrator from the safety of the house. So that Saturday night, once the house had settled into quiet, the two of them slipped out the back together and moved towards the fence. Alex carried a flashlight. The narrator carried a bag with water bottles that knocked softly against each other with every step into the warm night air. For a while, the walk through the gully was genuinely, almost disappointingly uneventful. They startled a hidden nest of birds at one point, the birds erupting upward into the branches in a sudden flurry that made both of them flinch. Alex thought they spotted a deer moving between the trees. The flashlight beam cut through the dark in a narrow yellow stripe. It felt like an adventure, the ordinary, manageable kind. Until they reached the old dry stream bed. The moment they crossed that carved stretch of packed dirt, everything changed. Alex stopped walking and muttered something quiet, something like, "I don't feel so good," and then bent forward suddenly, clutching their stomach, and was sick into the bushes. Hard and abrupt, hands shaking against their knees while they recovered. The narrator handed over water, checked on them, and Alex insisted they were fine, blaming something they had eaten earlier in the evening. And then, almost immediately after that, the narrator felt it too. A wave of cold so sudden and complete that it was like stepping into a walk-in freezer in the middle of summer. Their legs started shaking. Their stomach turned. For a moment, they were certain they were going to be sick as well. They both sat down near the edge of the dry stream bed, breathing carefully, waiting for the shaking and the nausea to pass. They had been sitting there perhaps a minute, maybe less, when something struck the narrator hard in the middle of their back. A small, sharp, very deliberate impact. The kind that stings and leaves a mark. Their first thought was a falling pine cone or a bug, something with a simple, ordinary explanation. But then Alex stiffened beside them and told the narrator to stop poking their back with whatever they were using. Before either of them could respond to that, a voice came from directly behind them. Quiet, calm, unhurried. "I'm here." And that calm, the absence of drama, the softness of it, made it so much worse than a shout could ever have been. Both of them screamed without looking at each other and ran, scrambling up the uneven slope, feet sliding on loose soil, arms pumping, running as fast as the terrain allowed back in the direction of Alex's house. The narrator risked one single glance over their shoulder. Nothing was following. No shape, no figure, no movement in the darkness behind them. But then another small pebble connected with the back of the narrator's calf, sharp enough to sting, deliberate enough to make it absolutely clear that whatever was. Back there was aiming, and they ran harder. Eventually, they had to stop. Alex has asthma, and the full sprint had taken its toll. They stood together in the dark, hunched over and gasping, surrounded by nothing but crickets and the sound of their own breathing. No crashing footsteps in the undergrowth. No snapping twigs or sliding rocks. No indication at all that anyone, any physical person, was still behind them. Once Alex could breathe properly again, they agreed to head back to the house. They walked the return path slowly now, shaken and quiet, the flashlight sweeping the uneven ground ahead of them. And that is when the beam slid over something that stopped them both cold. Two large pits in the ground, each one roughly the size of a mattress and far deeper than you would ever expect, deep enough to fit 3 mattresses stacked on top of each other. The sides were too clean, too straight, too deliberate to be the product of ordinary erosion. They looked dug, intentional, and staring down into them produced a feeling in the stomach that had nothing to do with the cold. Alex, feeling a flicker of bravery, jumped down into one of the pits. They swept the flashlight around and reported back what they found. A torn strip of old police tape, half buried in the dirt, the rubber sole from someone's shoe, a broken necklace tangled in the soil. Any of it could have been random litter, the accumulated debris of decades of teenagers climbing fences and poking around places they were not supposed to be. But given the rumors, given the legend, given everything that had already happened in the last 20 minutes, it did not feel like random litter. And then the narrator could not breathe. Not figuratively, not as an expression of fear. Physically, suddenly, as though something had wrapped around their lungs and squeezed. The air would not come in. They could not call down to Alex. Their jacket hood had snagged on something above them, and before they could understand what was happening, their feet had left the ground. This is the part of the story that the narrator repeats very clearly and deliberately because it needs to be understood. They were at least 2 feet off the ground, hanging, kicking at air. The fabric of the hood pulled tight around their throat, cutting off what little breath they had managed to draw, and they were being pulled higher, not swinging, not dangling by accident, but actively. Steadily lifted. In that moment, with their feet uselessly pedaling against nothing and the hood pressing harder against their windpipe, they had a terrifyingly clear and specific thought about their parents being told they had accidentally hanged themselves in a ravine. It was Alex's voice that cut through, loud enough to reach them, sharp enough to break through the panic. Alex shouted at them to raise their arms, both arms, straight up and slip out of the jacket entirely. Stop pulling at the hood, slide free. They managed it, arms thrust upward, shoulders dropped, body slid downward, feet hit solid ground. The jacket remained hanging above them in the air, suspended on nothing they could see, perfectly still in the windless dark. And they ran. Both of them together, back to Alex's house at full speed, not one word exchanged between them the entire way. 2 months passed. During that time, the narrator could not let it go. The pits, the tape, the broken necklace, the voice in the dark, the jacket still hanging there. They began doing something they had never done before, real, deliberate research, going back through old newspapers from as far as 1982, and they found it, an article reporting that 3 young people had gone missing. Timothy, 17 years old. Juliana, 16, and Andres, also 16. Seeing their ages printed there, real names, real ages, real children, made the narrator's chest go tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with grief. Cross-referencing archives, they found gravestones for Juliana and Timothy in the local cemetery, weathered by time but unmistakable. Andres had been buried in his hometown several states away. One of the articles included the address of a surviving family member, Juliana's only sister, Marie, who still lived nearby. It took courage, but eventually the narrator went to visit her. They got to know her gradually, helped her with small things around the house, built enough of a quiet trust that asking the question finally felt possible. When they did ask about Juliana, Marie brought out a family photo album. She sat with them and showed them childhood photographs, ordinary, happy, heartbreaking in that particular way that photographs of people who are gone always become. And then she showed them the funeral pictures. And she told them everything she knew about the night those 3 young people disappeared. Marie said that Juliana, Andres, and Timothy had become close friends in junior high and stayed nearly inseparable from that point forward, right up until the night their lives ended. They had all gone to a party together. They were young and careless in the way young people sometimes are when they feel invincible, and they drank more than was wise. By the following morning, Juliana had been found buried in a shallow grave in the gully. Police searched the area for hours and discovered Andres lying face down in the old riverbed, already gone, with no explanation that anyone was willing to commit to print. Timothy's body was buried alongside Juliana's in a funeral that the community held on the same day, side by side, the church overflowing with flowers. In the photographs from the open casket service, the narrator saw what absence looked like made visible. Juliana's face, pale and still and somehow wrong in its stillness, and Timothy's casket, filled with fabric and flowers where a person should have been. Marie told the narrator something else, too, something that landed with particular weight. She had never liked Timothy. Not from the first time she met him, not at any point across all the years her sister spent in his company. He was aggressive. He was a bully. He had a cruelty in him that Marie recognized even when her sister could not see it. She had begged Juliana to walk away from him, begged her. And as so often happens when we love someone who has chosen a path that frightens us, Juliana had not listened. Alex, when the narrator shared all of this, came to a quiet and chilling conclusion. They believed the entity in the gully, the voice, the stones, the unseen hands that lifted the narrator into the air, is Timothy, something left behind by what happened down there, something that does not want anyone getting close to what was buried in that ground, something that still resents the intrusion. The narrator does not know what to believe. They have never gone back for their jacket. They are not sure they ever will. But then Alex called and asked the narrator to come over immediately. When they arrived, Alex was holding a Ouija board. They looked simultaneously thrilled and terrified, the expression of someone who knows they are about to do something unwise but has decided to do it anyway. They wanted to go to the gully with the board. They wanted to talk directly to Timothy and get answers. Because, as the narrator puts it with a kind of exhausted self-awareness, apparently they never learn. So they went, back through the fence, back down the slope, back into the dark and the cold and the strange, heavy air of the gully, where they set the board up on a patch of relatively flat ground beneath the trees. The narrator does not particularly like Ouija boards on principle, but they placed their phone beside them, recording audio, just in case anything happened that they would want to be able to verify later. That decision turned out to be important, because what happened next left gaps in the narrator's memory that the recording would later try, imperfectly, to fill. Alex began by introducing themselves to the board. The narrator followed. Both spelled out their names. Then Alex addressed Timothy directly, using his full name first, middle, and last, while the planchette sat motionless beneath their fingertips. 40 seconds passed in silence, filled only with wind and the sound of their own careful breathing. And then the planchette slid to, "I'm Tim." They worked through smaller, confirmatory questions first, trying to establish whether they were genuinely communicating with whoever claimed to be Timothy. The responses came consistently and in a pattern that felt coherent, if not entirely comfortable. Then Alex asked the question they had come to ask: what happened in 1982? The planchette went completely still. The air around them seemed to drop in temperature. A full minute and a half passed, with Alex and the narrator talking quietly to each other about the cold, about wanting answers, about the strangeness of being here again. Alex asked a second time, more directly, "What happened in 1982, Timothy?" The planchette moved. It slid to no. Both of them laughed nervously at that, the kind of laugh that has nowhere else to go. The narrator joked that no was not actually an answer, and then the board spelled out, slowly and deliberately, "Jay died 1982. Alex acknowledged this and clarified that yes, they knew Juliana had died, and then asked the next question clearly: who killed her? The planchette moved to, "A die, you die." The laughter stopped immediately. Alex asked whether anyone else was present with them, Andres or Juliana. The board spelled yes after a brief pause. Alex asked to speak with them. The board spelled no. Alex asked why. And that is when Alex's patience ran out. There was a snap of genuine anger cutting through the fear, the kind that comes when grief and frustration combine into something harder. Alex demanded, "Tell us what happened." They reset the planchette and asked the question again. And then, more quietly, more pointedly, "Did you kill them?" Silence, a full minute with nothing moving. Then the question again, pressed with something close to defiance. And then, slowly, the planchette moved to yes. And it simply sat there. Alex threw the planchette into the bushes, hard, and the sound of it crashing into the undergrowth snapped the narrator back from whatever strange, suspended state they had been in. They stumbled backward, suddenly and acutely aware of how dark everything was, how cold the air had become, how very far from safety they were. They ran after Alex, who ran back to the house in complete and unbroken silence. The drive to the narrator's home was wordless. When they pulled into the driveway, Alex sat motionless in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead at something the narrator could not see. The narrator asked whether they should play back the audio recording, whether they should listen to it together, somewhere safe, before too much time passed. Alex said no, and then said they were never touching a Ouija board again, especially not the one they had just left sitting in the gully. Alex came inside. The narrator made warm drinks. Eventually, Alex fell asleep on the sofa, and the narrator sat quietly in the lamplight and listened to the recording alone. The audio was full of wind and the steady rhythm of crickets, and underneath those layers, in the stretches of silence, there were faint whispering sounds that the narrator did not include in their transcription, deciding they were probably just interference or wind patterns or the microphone catching something ordinary. But then they reached the part of the recording where the board had spelled out, "You die." And Alex, sleeping on the sofa less than 3 feet away, whispered those exact words, those exact letters, in perfect rhythm with the audio, as though repeating something they were hearing in their sleep, as though something was speaking through them. The narrator grabbed the Bible from the shelf and sat very still and waited. Nothing else happened. The room stayed quiet, eventually still, and the narrator did not know what to make of any of it. Like this video if this story gave you chills, and share it with someone you know who loves a good, unsettling story. Stories like this deserve to be heard. In 1996, when the narrator's mother was 6 months pregnant, she and her sister decided to try using a Ouija board in the living room, the very same room where their mother, the narrator's grandmother, had passed away just 3 months earlier. They wanted to reach her. They wanted to know she was somewhere safe. They wanted to believe that a cheap cardboard gateway could bridge whatever distance separates the living from the dead. By their account, they spent roughly 30 minutes in careful, emotional conversation with something that presented itself as their mother, asking questions, receiving answers that felt meaningful and personal. And then, without warning, the planchette jerked violently, a sharp, sudden movement that neither of them claimed to have made. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, the kind of cold that has no business being there. And then the planchette began moving at a pace that was far beyond the gentle, exploratory sliding of before, racing across the board, dragging their fingers with it, spelling the same single word over and over and over again without any pause between repetitions. Mind, mind, mind. The word repeated itself with such relentless, terrifying urgency that the narrator's mother yanked her hand away from the board and ended the session immediately. They did not say goodbye. They did not close the board properly. They simply hid it away and tried to forget the cold and the racing planchette and the single awful word that had kept coming. A few weeks later, the narrator's mother went into labor, unexpectedly, far earlier than anyone had prepared for, a month and several weeks ahead of schedule, with doctors scrambling to understand what was happening and bracing for complications. The narrator was born small and fragile, kept in the hospital for 2 additional weeks until things stabilized. Eventually, mother and baby left together, and for a while it seemed like the strange chapter had finally closed. It had not. When the narrator turned 4, the nightmares began. The same dream, repeating with such regularity that it eventually became its own kind of familiar horror. In the dream, the narrator was always sitting at the top of the staircase inside their house. The light suggested daytime, but everything looked dim anyway, as though the light were too tired to reach properly into the corners. Their feet were completely fixed in place, sinking, as though the floor had turned to thick, slow quicksand that held without releasing. They would scream until their voice tore, and no sound reached anyone below. At the end of every version of this dream, something would begin to climb the staircase toward them, long, impossibly thin, moving with a slow, deliberate crawl from step to step. Its fingers were black and stretched into hooked, blade-like curves. Its eyes burned red against the dim light. Eventually, after having this dream so many times, the narrator learned to recognize the moment the creature came into view and forced themselves awake before it reached the top. They told their mother. Their mother said they were staying up too late and frightening themselves with stories. But the strange activity did not stop, and it did not stay contained to the narrator's experience. The narrator's little sister was around 2.5 years old at the time, very young, but sharp in a way that unnerved people even then. One evening, as their mother was finishing the bedtime routine, tucking both children in with the hallway light glowing softly through the doorway, the sister looked up from her pillow and spoke, not the way a toddler usually speaks. In a strange, lilting, sing-song voice, the kind you hear in horror films, playful and deeply wrong at the same time, she said, "Mommy, can you spell dark man better, run?" That same night, the narrator woke to find a woman standing at the end of their bed. An old woman, standing in complete silence, simply watching. She looked utterly real, so real that the narrator's first thought was that some actual elderly stranger had somehow entered the bedroom while the house slept. They screamed and reached for the bedside lamp. Light flooded the room, and the old woman was gone. The air where she had been standing was empty. The narrator kept the light on and spent the rest of the night rigid with the particular, bone-deep unease of someone who can no longer trust what they see in the dark. At some point, without meaning to, they must have drifted back to sleep. They came back to consciousness in darkness again, the lamp somehow off, no memory of switching it, to find the old woman standing closer than before, right at the edge of the bed. And this time, something was different about her. Her skin had taken on a bluish cast, the color of something that has been in the cold too long. Her teeth were rotten and jagged. Her eyes were an unnatural, electric shade of blue that held no warmth at all. She began to laugh, softly at first, a small, tittering giggle that did not match her expression or her eyes. The giggle widened and rose into a cackle, and then, just as abruptly as it began, it stopped. Her head snapped down toward the narrator with a speed that no person should be capable of. And she spoke in a low, flat voice, "Cover your head, piggy." The narrator obeyed, pulled the blankets over their face, drew their knees to their chest, and lay completely still. After everything had been shared with their mother, every detail, every word, the response finally shifted. This was no longer something to be explained away. The narrator's grandfather, who was a pastor, came to the house. He walked every room. He blessed every corner. He prayed as he went, quietly and seriously. And after that, things did ease. Not completely, the strange pattern did not disappear entirely, but the intensity pulled back into something more manageable. Time passed. The narrator grew. Eventually, they moved to a bedroom downstairs, their own space at last, while their sister stayed in a room above. And every single night, without exception, they would wake at exactly 4:30 in the morning. Not to an alarm, not to any sound they could explain. Just awake suddenly and completely. And then they would hear it, footsteps, slow, deliberate, working their way down the staircase, one creaking board at a time, coming steadily toward their room, stopping at their door, which would then begin to open, slowly. The familiar sound of that particular hinge, a sound they knew better than any other sound in the house. No one ever stood in the doorway, only darkness, only the sense of something present in the absence. After a moment or two, the door would quietly close again and the footsteps would not return. Not that night, but they would come back the next night, and the one after that. After years and years in that house, the family finally moved when the narrator was 17. And for a long while, things seemed to have been left behind at that address. Then came one particular June night in the new home. The family had weathered a brutal thunderstorm that afternoon, the kind that rattles windows and unsettles the whole atmosphere of a house. The power had gone out, plunging everything into darkness. And since there was nothing left to do, they all went to bed. All three of them, the narrator, their mother, and their sister, woke at exactly the same moment. No gradual stirring, no dream that faded into consciousness. Just all three of them awake simultaneously in a room that was pitch dark and far too cold for a summer night with no air conditioning running. And in the doorway of the bedroom there stood something, tall, at least 7 feet, possibly more, blocking whatever dim light the hallway offered. A shape in the dark so large and so still that for a moment no one breathed. And then the narrator heard it. The same laugh, the soft one that grew into the cackle. The one they had heard at the edge of their childhood bed all those years ago, the one that lived in a specific, unchanged part of their memory. And then the voice, low and deliberate, "I found you." 3 words and then nothing, as though it had never been there at all. Years went by without another clear incident, long enough that the narrator began to wonder cautiously whether it was finally over. They had moved to Florida with their partner, who later became their husband. He worked night shifts regularly, leaving the narrator alone in a house that was small and quiet, and they thought, ordinary. One night around 1 in the morning, they went outside to the front yard to smoke and get some air. As they turned to go back inside, they noticed a long, dark arm hanging down over the edge of the roof, ending in clawed fingers, reaching, stretching toward their head as though about to grab them. The narrator told their husband. He was gentle and concerned, and gently suggested they might be tired or stressed or both. But his gentle skepticism did not last long, because later he saw the same shape himself, perched on the roof, watching, and went quiet in the way that people go quiet when an explanation they trusted no longer holds. And the narrator is left with the same question, circling back on itself endlessly. Why the roof? What is it waiting for? When will it stop watching from the outside and try to come back in? And most troubling of all, is it possible that whatever this entity is, it was summoned through the board that night in 1996, when two grieving women sat in a cold living room asking a cardboard gateway to bring back someone they had lost? Is that the reason this thing has followed across decades and state lines, and every address the narrator has ever called home? What do you think? A few years ago, a close group of friends decided to visit an abandoned house on the edge of their town. It was a place that carried its own reputation, stories of families who had fled in the night, strange lights in the windows, shadowy shapes crossing the property. The group was small, united by a shared love of exploring places like this. And that night they brought candles, some meditation materials, and against what they themselves described as their better judgment, a Ouija board. From the moment they stepped through the door, the atmosphere was wrong. Not just atmospheric in the way an old abandoned house is atmospheric. Wrong in a more particular way, like something inside the darkness was actively watching them settle in, studying their movements. They sat in what had once been the living room, wallpaper peeling in long pale strips, floors warping and groaning under every step. Candles were lit. The circle was formed. The session began. At first it was everything you might expect, inconsistent movements, letters that arranged into nothing meaningful, the familiar back and forth of a group half believing and half skeptical. But the mood changed. The responses became coherent, too coherent, and the energy in the room shifted from curious to hostile in a way that nobody announced aloud but everybody felt at the same time. The messages from the board grew darker and more aggressive. The group ended the session and attempted to ground themselves with meditation. The unease did not lift. By 2 in the morning, there was a collective, wordless agreement that they had to leave immediately. That staying even one more minute would be a serious mistake. They piled into the truck and drove as though something were right behind them because it felt with complete and uncomfortable conviction like something was. That feeling did not lift until they were several miles from the house. And then, suddenly, it was gone. The truck cab felt quiet, safe, normal. They thought they had made it. Within days, their home became unbearable. Loud crashes in the middle of the night. A smell of decay appearing in different rooms with no identifiable source, then vanishing. Arguments breaking out over nothing, sudden, venomous, completely out of character. And then the shadow. Figures, moving in peripheral vision, crossing doorways, lingering in corners just long enough to see but not long enough to confirm. Voices in the dark. Hair pulled. Stairs navigated at speed and still ended in near falls that left bruises. Sleep, when it came at all, brought nightmares vivid enough to feel like lived experience. They brought people in to cleanse the house. They had it blessed. Each time there was a brief easing, a few days of something approaching calm, and then the activity returned worse than before. Eventually, the pattern became clear, the common thread. Everything had started with the board. They packaged it up and donated it to a museum that specialized in haunted artifacts. Almost immediately, the house began to breathe again. Life normalized slowly and imperfectly. They eventually moved, looking for a fresh start. Years later, the narrator still thinks about the drive home from the abandoned house. About how the calm that settled over the truck felt like safety, like escape. But they understand now, from the distance of years, that they had it entirely wrong. The calm was not because the thing had given up. It was because it had already arrived. It had not been chasing them. It had simply come home with them instead. This next story comes with a specific location, offered as context: the Greenwood Cemetery in Spokane, Washington. Locally well known for its reputation, it features a particular entrance, an old, broken staircase that locals call the 1,000 Steps. Many people in the city carry their own accounts of strange sightings on those steps, of feeling suddenly and unaccountably depressed while walking up them. This story, however, takes place not on the steps but in the cemetery itself, in 2021. A group of 4 friends, 2 male, 1 female, plus the narrator, entered through the 1,000 Steps and spent some time wandering among the headstones. The female friend wanted a photo taken, so one of the others took it. And immediately after the shutter clicked, the second male friend showed everyone what was visible in the image behind the narrator's shoulder. A shadow figure, clearly not one of them. They searched the area behind where the photo had been taken, looking for any physical explanation, a piece of fence, a trick of light, anything that could account for the shape in the image. The same friend took another photograph of that exact spot. Nothing appeared in the second image, nothing that hadn't been in the first one. The group agreed quietly that what was standing behind the narrator in that photograph was not something that belonged to the living world. And with that acknowledged and no one entirely sure what to do with the knowledge, they moved closer to the entrance they had come through. There was a large circular platform of cement set into the ground, perhaps 15 feet across, and they gathered there to sit and decompress and talk. And then the narrator brought out the Ouija board. They asked if anyone wanted to try it with them. Every single friend present said no. The narrator, to their own later amusement, describes themselves in that moment as the archetypal impulsive character from every horror film ever made, the one who continues despite every signal telling them to stop. They decided to use the board alone. And they note that they are usually someone highly observant, someone who notices oddities before others do, someone with strong instincts and a level head. But from the moment their fingers touched the planchette, something felt different, slightly blurred, as though some quiet, protective part of their awareness had been gently switched off. The spirit on the board had a simple, consistent message. It kept moving to yes or to the letter U over and over. The narrator, strangely unaware, kept asking different questions. Is there something you would like to tell us? You, is there something you want? You, do you mean someone in this group? You, do you mean you, as in me specifically? Their friends, who had been watching this unfold with increasing alarm, either allowed the board to answer or pulled the narrator's hands away before the answer could come. They ended the session, and the moment the narrator's fingers left the planchette, they felt it, a rush of anxiety that crashed back in like a wave returning to shore. Sharp and immediate and entirely out of character. They left the cemetery right away. Their closest friend, walking beside them, kept returning to the same thing, how strange it had been to watch the narrator, someone always quick to read a situation, completely miss what the spirit was saying. How unlike them it was to keep asking new questions instead of recognizing what was being spelled for them. The narrator agrees. It was completely out of character. Something had been, in their own words, softened. They do not know whether the entity visible in the photograph and the spirit on the board were the same, and they have decided with some firmness that they do not particularly need to find out. What do you think will happen next in each of these stories? Write your guesses in the comments below. We read every single one. And don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss a new story when we post. Our next account begins with a Halloween party and a group of teenagers who were, at 17, perhaps not making the most considered decisions of their lives. The narrator went to a friend's house. They were too young and too careless to proceed with their original plans that night. So the Ouija session was moved to a separate occasion, sober, intentional, with more of the same people gathered together and something approaching an open mind. There were many of them there, taking turns with the board in smaller groups rather than crowding around it all at once. At one point, the narrator believed they had made contact with a family member. Then something shifted. The responses changed in character, became colder, sharper, focused with a very particular hostility that seemed directed specifically at the narrator, not at the group, at them. And then the board spelled a name, Bal. No one present recognized it. No one had heard it before. Later, the narrator searched for it and found that it was the name of a demon. They emphasized this detail with some care. Everyone present had attended Catholic school their entire lives, but none of them had any real investment in religion, no interest in demonology, no knowledge of which names appeared in which traditions. And yet the board had spelled it. A girl in the group began to feel unwell, suddenly drowsy and physically sick, and they agreed to stop for the night and treat the whole thing as an unusual experience best set aside. But the narrator could not set it aside. Something in them had been lit, an itch they could not quite reach, and it would eventually lead somewhere much darker. What followed over the months ahead was a regular practice. The narrator and their two closest friends used the board frequently, attempting to communicate with spirit guides, with other presences, with whatever made itself available. Bal became a recurring and unwelcome interruption. Through those sessions, the narrator was told by what presented itself as a spirit guide that they possessed particular ability, a kind of gift for driving out negative entities, a role in some larger spiritual conflict. And it was suggested that this was precisely why Baal was so hostile toward them specifically. That the entity's intention was to prevent the narrator from fulfilling that role through the most permanent means available. The narrator acknowledges how strange this sounds, but the sense of purpose it gave them was real, and it kept them coming back to the board. Of all the sessions they conducted across that period, one stands apart from the rest. One of the narrator's friends had developed a growing sensitivity to the emotional states of the spirits they encountered, not just communicating with them, but feeling them. They agreed to conduct a session together, sensing that someone or something needed assistance. The session began, and contact was made with what seemed to be a young girl, angry and in considerable pain. But this presence was not behaving the way a spirit usually did. And then the narrator heard it, right in their ear, close enough that there was no question about the source, a scream. Loud and piercing and absolutely real to every physical sense. They flinched, barely managing to keep their fingers on the board, told their friend that whatever this was, it was not friendly, and then heard another scream further away this time, but no less sharp, and simultaneously felt a pain shoot through their head. Exactly the kind of crushing pressure that comes with brain freeze, the type they had learned to associate with the presence of something particularly dark or hostile. They tried everything they knew to help the presence leave. They could not. Eventually they stopped, and that was the last time. The narrator does not touch Ouija boards anymore. Our final story takes a different angle, not a personal account of a session gone wrong, but a reflection on belief, faith, and the question that sits at the very heart of every story we have shared tonight. Who, or what, are we actually talking to when the planchette moves? The narrator's family are devoted Christians, and their position on Ouija boards is specific and unambiguous. They do not believe that the entities encountered through the board are the souls of departed human beings. They believe that human souls, if they are in a place of peace after death, are not wandering around waiting to be contacted through a piece of cardboard, which raises the obvious question. If the people we love are genuinely at rest somewhere beyond our reach, then what exactly is responding when we ask it questions? What is the thing that knows our names, our secrets, our fears? The answer the narrator's family holds is that it is something that is pretending to be our loved ones. Something that uses grief as an opening, familiarity as a disguise, and love as the most reliable possible lever. Within their family, this belief is not merely theological. It is grounded in experience. There was a relative named Paul who used Ouija boards regularly and who had come away from a session with knowledge of his own death, specific, accurate, and soon to be confirmed. He arranged for his son to be safely with the child's mother before the accident that took his life. His wife, Mary, who was also in the accident, suffered catastrophic brain injuries. The prognosis was as bleak as it can be. The word vegetative was used, and with medical weight behind it. But Mary recovered. The recovery was extraordinary and slow, and the narrator's family attributes it to prayer, consistent care, and a commitment to living in the way their faith prescribed, alongside the medical treatment she received. It is described, simply and without excessive drama, as a miracle. One detail that stays with the narrator's mother from before the accident: the unnaturally drained color of Mary's face during the period she was using the board. In a family where darker complexions are the norm, that particular pallor, blanched and wrong and deeply unsettling, stood out as something that could not be easily explained. The narrator's mother believed it was not simply exhaustion or illness. She believed it was something being drawn out of the woman through her continued contact with whatever the board was connecting her to. And that, dear friends, is where tonight's stories come to a close. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, for listening with an open mind and an open heart, and for trusting us with an evening of the kind of stories that stay with you long after the telling is done. Whether you believe in the paranormal, hold your skepticism close, or sit somewhere in the uncertain, fascinating space between, we hope this collection gave you something to think about, something to feel, something to carry with you into the quiet of the night. We will be back very soon with a brand new collection of stories, and you will absolutely not want to miss it. If you would like to support the channel and be part of what we are building here, please check the link to our Patreon in the description below. There is some wonderful exclusive content waiting there for you. Until then, take care of yourselves, look after the people you love, and perhaps, just perhaps, think twice before you pick up any board that promises to connect you to whatever waits on the other side. Good night, everyone. Stay safe and sweet dreams.